purpose of today's event is that we mark the launch of the strategic framework with a reflection on the ecosystem for civil society and what that should look like. That would be obviously what the strategic framework is about. And so we've asked some people to come in and they will introduce themselves as we go, and we'll get some perspectives from them. I have a few questions to ask the speakers after they've made their presentations, and we'll see how the conversation goes. So it might help if I told you who I was. So my name is Ashley Green Thompson, a very colonial sounding name, but I assure you I'm a son of the African soil. I'm based in Johannesburg, and for my sins, I think I've been recruited to the board of INTRAC, and this is what they do to you. As soon as you become a member, they put you to work. So I've been asked to chair this session, which I will do. So that you know who I am, I run an organization called Act Ubumbano, which operates in Southern Africa and is basically a space for solidarity and for support to local struggles and community-based initiatives in about 7 or 8 countries in Southern Africa. You're more than welcome to sign up for our newsletter. It is a wealth of information. In fact, I encourage you to do so. So we've got 5 speakers with us today. We're going to ask Kate Newman to kick off. And as I've indicated, with each of the speakers, I'm going to ask them to very briefly introduce who they are. And then they've got about 7 minutes to capture the points that they want to raise. So we've got Kate Newman, we have Ann Clements next, and after Ann, we'll have Everjoice Win. After Everjoice, we'll have Clara Bosco, and our final speaker will be Isabela Souza. So I'm not going to say any more and invite Kate Newman to address the meeting. Kate?
I'm Kate Newman. I'm the CEO of INTRAC. I've been with INTRAC for a couple of years, and so I'm speaking first, given that this is our launch of our strategy, but I'm sure the other panelists will be much more interesting than me, really. So I will speak quickly and pass you on to them. I want to start by saying how great it is to be here. Our work to develop our strategic framework began about a year ago with discussions with actors across the sector. And we spoke to lots of people. We spoke to local actors, funders, staff from big and small NGOs, movement members, consultants, asking them what they thought the key challenges were that were facing civil society today and where INTRAC could contribute best. And ideas have very much sort of shaped our understanding and challenged our thinking. And this framework that we're launching today draws very much on all the thinking that was shared with us. So I wanted to thank everyone who contributed to help get to this point. We're very proud of our framework, and we're looking forward to collaborating with others as we move towards implementation. So onto the discussion for today. I thought I'd start by sharing why we're talking about the ecosystem of civil society support. Our starting point at INTRAC is that we're unashamedly for civil society. We believe that vibrant, diverse and inclusive civil societies are essential catalysts for a world where everyone can thrive. However, we're also concerned about the level of challenge facing civil society actors today, whether this is due to external global challenges such as climate change, or nationally due to constrained civic space and unaccountable governance, or internally inside the organisations as they grapple with challenging resourcing environments or the requirements of leadership and the complexity of understanding their contribution to change as they respond to the myriad of expectations different organisations place on them. To navigate and respond to the changing environments and to focus on the things that matter, civil society actors and organisations need support. This support can enable them to be resilient, legitimate and impactful, and to do what they want to do better. But what this support looks like and means is different in different places. It depends on the context and nature of civil society. For some, there may be basic organisational development needs, and for others, it might be about navigating their changing environment, or they might want support to help them understand the contribution to change they're trying to make, or to respond to internal challenges or in developing new partnerships. There'll be different needs at different times in different places. And over the past 30 years of our work, we've noticed that appropriate support is not always available. And where it is available, it's not necessarily accessed. In fact, much of what's commissioned as civil society support is designed and funded by actors based in the global north or global minority and delivered to actors working in the global south or global majority. At times, this support may be high quality, but equally it may not. It may reinforce the historic power structures that dominate in the international aid sector, and it might undervalue contextualized knowledge and experience, undermine local markets, and limit the development of long-term sustainable civil society. So reflecting on this reality caused us to start talking about the ecosystems of support and what these should look like. And we thought about the nature and health of civil society more generally and how a strong civil society needs to think about what support is available and how it's rooted in the context. The key elements of this ecosystem will look different from different perspectives, and I hope my fellow contributors on the panel will share some ideas from their perspective, given the work they do and where they sit. And to have a strong functioning ecosystem will need coordinated action across a wide diversity of actors. So I'm just going to share a few ideas about INTRAC's perspective and how we think we can best contribute. Our focus, as most of you will know, is on organisational strengthening. We support actors, organisations, networks and alliances in MEL, strategy design, impact assessment, organisational change and partnership, among other things. And we're commissioned as consultants. We deliver practitioner research and we deliver training. The big shift in this strategic framework is to ensure that an increasing percentage of our training, consultancy and research will be delivered by a network of consultants who are rooted locally and connected nationally and globally. We intend to develop a network mindset and become network-led, and will be influenced and informed by the priorities, insights and aspirations of our network members and the other networks we interact with. Together, we'll work to shift how civil society support is conceived and delivered and strengthen locally rooted and globally connected ecosystems of civil society support. In this strategy period, we've developed 4 organisational goals. We intend to build a locally led, globally connected network with the members rooted in local culture, practice and knowledge and connecting globally for sense-making, learning and collective action. We want to transform the role and reputation of consultancy across the international development sector, driving demand for and strengthening the status of locally rooted, globally connected, ethical and values-driven consultants. And we want to support global and national actors to reimagine their roles and relationships, standing alongside and collaborating with others to develop advisory and support services for those who are actively seeking to decolonise and shift their power. To do this, we'll also need to evolve our own organisational model and the way we're funded, our skills and capabilities, and we want to focus on becoming truly diverse, anti-racist and feminist. I just want to talk a little bit about what we mean by ethical and values-driven consultancy, because this is such an important part of the ecosystem. For us, we want to think about the knowledge, skills and experience each consultant brings and sort of put lived experience and context-based knowledge on a par alongside the technical consultancy skills they might have. We think the nature of consultancy is really important, and at the heart of it, it's about the relationships that are established. If there are good relationships, this promotes openness, honesty and trust. And then as a consultant, you can work alongside that civil society organisation to get to the heart of the matter, enabling long-term ownership and sustainable change. And then there's the intention of the consultancy to shift power, to build inclusivity, diversity and equity, both within our own organisation through the work we do and how we do it, but also in wider civil society through challenging approaches that reinforce unequal power. The final point I wanted to make is why, in thinking about this ecosystem of support, we are putting so much emphasis on being locally rooted but globally connected. We think if power is going to shift in the international development sector, you need to look horizontally as well as vertically. This means asking what infrastructure exists around the actors that are working to reclaim power and the actors who in the future should be leading the development and their struggles for justice in their own contexts. A sustainable local ecosystem of civil society support is a crucial part of creating the enabling environment to shift the power. Such support is central to how these actors will navigate their new challenges, and it's an essential element of the long-term health of civil society nationally. However, we also see the benefit of global relationships. This is both true for the reality of today, where global resource flows are important for national civil society, but will continue to be important even in a future beyond aid, should this ever be achieved. because civil society will always benefit from global linkages and solidarity action to ensure that the issues of equity and justice are paid attention to share learning and influence beyond borders, and to provide wider support infrastructure and access to experience when this is needed. So for us, the intention in our new strategic framework will enable us to bring the best of both dimensions, linking locally to globally and globally to locally, to contribute to the vibrant, diverse and inclusive civil societies that are essential catalysts for a world where everyone can thrive.
Hi everyone, I'm Ann Clements. Some of you know me, some of you won't. I'm currently co-CEO at International, working from the UK alongside my co-CEO, who's Frederica Uko, who's based in Kenya. Very briefly, a visual description. I'm a white woman in a blue dress with shoulder-length brown hair and glasses. And that's important for me to say because AD International is an international NGO that's transforming into becoming a participatory grant maker in the disability justice space. So AD's always existed to resource activists, but participatory grant making is quite a radical change in our approach to doing so. And the first thing I wanted to speak about today is that a key part of getting to that decision to change how we do things has been agreeing what we'll stop doing, the things that are no longer our role in the ecosystem. So those of us like AD who are located in entities that are based in the minority world, in the global north, so-called, those of us in institutions that have perhaps traditionally held more power, in particular, I think, will have to do less in future and minimize the space and resources that we take up in the ecosystem. And that's not to say there isn't a role, as Kate's already mentioned, global linkages and solidarity feel really critical in these times. And I know others will speak more about these times in this session. But it is to say that I think we need to get in right relationship to what our role should be and shouldn't be. And that the process of doing that is some undoing of decisions that might have been made in the past, or that's been our experience at least, some stopping doing things, some letting go. And these things are difficult, they're crunchy in reality because they affect staff, including some of our staff at AD. We have a number of staff, actually a majority of our staff in the majority world. But they're critical if we're going to take a right-sized role in the civil society ecosystem in future, because INGOs, and I'm speaking from that perspective today, doing it all and trying to cover all the bases is one way that we've, I think, consolidated power in a number of different ways. And so whilst we all have different models, it's often the case, I think, that international NGOs have taken up too many resources and too much space doing work themselves. And we know, and I think most people on this call would agree, that harms civil society in multiple different ways. And it includes, as an example, the way that Kate's already mentioned, so I won't go into it in detail, but the way in which we might hire consultants for their technical skills or familiarity with the task, often consultants that don't come from the context, don't have lived experience. And sometimes we simply prioritise people in our own networks or networks of privilege. And things like that have to change if we want to stop perpetuating the power and resource dynamics that are so keenly recognised in the system, but are proving so difficult to shift. So one thing we've committed to do is close out all our programming and instead become this participatory channel through which resources will flow to disability justice activists. And so we're stopping doing programming. And whilst our strategy commits to supporting organisational strengthening and support needs that our grantees might have, we also won't be providing that support directly ourselves, because we think that sort of support, which we used to call in our old model capacity building, perpetuates power dynamics that don't support the strengthening of activism's own ecosystems, and again tend to consolidate power in international NGOs. And I will say these are tough decisions for some of our staff, including those, as I've said, in countries where ads traditionally work. They affect people's jobs and livelihoods, and we can't do them overnight. But our commitment to care for our staff also means that as we make these difficult decisions, we're investing in their well-being and retraining, and we need the sort of organisational strengthening that INTRAC's networks will continue to exist to support some of our staff, for example, developing skills in participatory grant making, others choosing to leave and go somewhere new. That whole infrastructure of support to help people move on or develop new skills is really important. But I think these sort of decisions to stop doing things and support people to do different things or strengthen new skills, and organisations to take a right role in the system is crucial if we want to disrupt where power lives in the system. And I think that's the bedrock of this new strategy from INTRAC, and it is of ours as well at AD, because we recognise that there's a way that we can utilise our existing privilege as an organisation, by which we mean connections and positionality, having been an international NGO that was registered 40 years ago in the UK, to help funding flow to disability justice organisations, including helping it flow through channels that don't involve us at all. But we also recognise in our strategy that if that works, we might not need to exist in future. We're not here for the sake of being AD or being an international NGO, but we are here to play a part in rebalancing a flow of resources. And hopefully that might mean we don't need to be here in future, because it's the ecosystem and not us that matters. If we're here to make things truly different in that system, we have to be willing to not just change our role now in the present moment, but also perhaps erase it in future. So I feel like, yeah, I wanted to speak from that INGO place and that place of stopping doing things and having a right role in the system, because it feels like in relation to what INTRAC is launching in this strategy, that the stepping back of international NGOs is critical, but the resourcing of organisational strengthening and services like consultancy that INTRAC proposes in this strategy will be really critical support to that change.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks, Kate, and all the colleagues for inviting me into this space. I'm not sure why I got invited, because at the moment I am on sort of gardening leave from civil society, INGOs, and I'm literally hanging by a thread on the sidelines. So that's the space that I'm speaking from. Over the last 2.5 years, I've really just been observing and participating in conversations, within the sector, but from a place where I'm not connected. But if you want to know where I've been, half of my life in the women's movement, feminist space, the other half of my working life in international NGO space, and this other last few years of my life, I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing, but let's see. I think the two previous speakers have actually made my life easy, and so thanks, Marianne, for where you're leaving things off, because that's where I want to start from. So in this particular moment where the conversation in the INGO space, let me put it that way, in civil society, has been around shifting power, so-called localization, decolonization, right? And then we're talking about, capacity building and what that could look like, and what the needs around that should be. And I think it's a crucial moment. It's an interesting moment. On one hand, I think offering quite a myriad of opportunities, particularly for those who are working on the front lines, who have always, raised concerns around the hogging of power, whether it's financial, whether it's political, power, et cetera, et cetera. I think, we're quite familiar with that. And on the other hand, it's an exciting moment in terms of, those who have been on that lower end of the spectrum of power, so to speak, beginning to step into their power, not beginning, I think strengthening, they are stepping into their power, right? So we've had the hashtag shift the power. So I want to talk about the hashtag reclaiming our power or stepping into our power. So I'm speaking sort of as a Southern person, as a Southern leader, looking at these conversations at the moment and what I see as some of the issues around so-called capacity building, could be. I think those of you who've been involved in the Ringo initiative, for example, just to get that out of the way, I think over the last 2 years and some, have heard the message, and the message has been quite clear. Capacity building is one of those, to put it bluntly, swear words in our sector. I think we had that message quite loudly and clearly, that very often it's been used as shorthand for something else, right? Whether it's we don't trust you, whether it's we don't think you have the knowledge, whether it's we don't think you have the intellectual capacity, whether we think it's you're not feminist enough, so capacity building has tended to be used kind of as shorthand for something else, and so definitely it's one of those as part of the Ringo initiative that has come up for conversation, and I'm glad there has been agreement that as a new lexicon. So there's a group that is working on a new lexicon for the sector, and it's one of those phrases that's definitely going to be included in a new lexicon, because we do need to talk about a new way of, in a new way about what do we really mean, and how do we talk about increasing, expanding, supporting, unleashing, right? Southern leadership, Southern agency, those on the front lines, those who live the issues, ability to do what they want to do and be able to do it effectively. So capacity building, we just need to find a different way of talking about it, I think. So going back to that hashtag shifting the power. So if we are to flip the script, right? If we are talking about those who have been on the receiving end of the power spectrum, as I said, if we are to flip the script and then to talk about stepping into their power, reclaiming their power, what is it that they would be talking about, and what is it that they would define as some of their needs in this moment? I don't claim to speak on behalf of, all of civil society, but, I think for me, just a couple of things. So one is around the whole issue of global, right? So connecting the global and the local, because very often a lot of the actors, particularly in the global South, have tended to be seen as very local, as if there is no local in the global North, right? And so as they seek to step up their work, their visibility, their leadership in both the local space and the global space, and connecting their work at those two ends of the spectrum, I think there is need there, therefore, to talk about what kind of support would they need, and what kind of, as we talk about an ecosystem, what could that ecosystem look like? I'm sorry, I'm not going to provide the answers. I'm just throwing it out there, as so that we expand the conversation. So, being local, I think there is a lot of emphasis on rootedness, right? On relevance. And I think it goes without saying, a lot of the Southern actors have been very, very rooted, have really deepened, their connections to local people. I mean, if you go back to participatory development from the 1980s, the 1990s, all the work around popular education, all the work around, HIV and AIDS, for example, some of the methodologies there, work around participatory rural appraisal, some of the work of people like Robert Chambers. That was amazing work. But I think what's happened, in my opinion, over the last 2 decades, I would say, I think we have lost some of that skill. We have lost some of that capacity, because they tended to be a disproportionate focus, if one might put it that way, on policy advocacy, right? Policy advocacy / lobbying. So right now, if you look across civil society in the global South, you will find a lot of very educated people, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being very educated people, very smart. They can, do policy briefs in their sleep. They know who the power holders are. So, very, very much a lot of the skill has been around policy influencing, legislative reform, constitutional reform, and in that kind of space. A lot of the skill that we used to have to do really rooted work with communities, I think has in some ways been lost. So I think we need to rebuild a lot of that, reclaim some of that, and have some of the groups and some of the individuals who are doing that work, regrouping, because what I then see as a danger is if you look at where the conversation around locally led development is going, you will then find that there seems to be almost a suggestion that nobody knows how to do this work. So, some of the funding agencies, for example, I will not name names, but I can mention them if you want, who are some of the organizations that destroyed that local capacity, that locally led development, and tended to give support, to big contractors from their own countries, etc. They are the ones now who are sort of on the front lines of locally led development. And you're like, you are now on the front lines of this. What happened to all those 20 years in which you destroyed, literally, that capacity that we used to have? And so I think there is a need to rebuild that. There is a need to acknowledge that and support, that capacity, there. All right. I think the other issue for me is around connecting the dots, connecting struggles, right? I think it's very clear that some of the ways in which we have tended to work on development issues writ large hasn't served us well, right? The focus on the magic bullet, whether it was education, whether it was women's political participation, whatever it was, I think hasn't served us well. And now we are seeing it with climate. This almost singular focus on climate at the expense of everything else. So I think in terms of where we are now, I think movements, leaders need that connection, need that support to be able to really bring issues together and work collectively as movements around common sets of issues, because we know these issues are connected. Hence, we are now talking about, intersectionality. Building collective power, I think it goes without saying. This is the moment of movements. So the heightened conversation, the heightened focus on social movements and what they are able to do. I think my fear there is that if we don't support these movements, if we don't take enough care in terms of how that focus on movements is going, I think we are likely then to be in danger of overwhelming them, expecting far too much from them if there isn't enough of support for them to do what they need.
Thank you for the invite as well. So my name is Clara Bosco. I am the Senior Advisor on Civil Society Resourcing with CIVICUS Global Alliance. I am calling from an unusually sunny and summery Amsterdam. Mildly daunted to speak after the brilliant intervention of Everjoice. But what I wanted to share with you is two key challenges that I think civil society is facing today, and that could stimulate a bit of reflections perhaps around what kind of support and strengthening approaches could be necessary. So sort of just to start, I'd like to share that from where we stand at CIVICUS, we are noticing a discernible rise in closure of civic space around the world, something that really impacts directly the ability of all civil society groups in whichever form and function they have to organize, to speak out, and to take action. And it's very much connected to the rise in authoritarianism and democratic regression trends that we're seeing around the world. And so just to give you some data about the severity of this regression, the latest CIVICUS monitor data points to a situation where over 70% of the world's population lives in countries where civic space is rated as severely restricted or completely closed. And less than 2% of the world's population now live in countries with completely open civic spaces. So that's, for me, something that we always have to keep in mind when we think about the strategies of support, solidarity, accompaniment for the sector. It's very difficult to give a bird's eye view on how this concretely, granularly materializes in civil society organizations, because every context is different. But of course, we see trends that I think could be relevant for this conversation that range from growing tactics to stifle dissent, to discourage speaking out, controlling narratives, and this affects all kinds of groups within civil society, including established civil society organizations, but also protesters, climate activists, defenders, etc. We see a persisting trend in demonizing and targeting particularly minority groups and vulnerable communities. So when we think about civic space, you have to acknowledge that civic space is not affecting homogeneously every type of group in our societies. We see continue to see a systematic exclusion of civil society from global fora where important global change agendas are discussed, be it the climate financing and climate action or the current global governance reform, things for which civil society has a range of solutions, of ideas, of proposals, and it doesn't get a seat at the table. We see a persisting trend also in sort of more and more disabling laws, regulations, increasing surveillance on operations and finances of civil society, which are accompanied with very problematic narratives revolving around the usual national security concerns, the counterterrorism, but also about public morality and decency, which are really making it hard for civil society to seek, receive, and use support and resources. Which brings me to the second challenge, which is connected, but I wanted to conceptually keep it separate, that I wanted to flag, which is the very challenging resourcing landscape that we see today. So domestically, as I said, the narratives, the laws and restrictions that I've mentioned before not only make it really hard for many groups to operate, but are also having a chilling effect on, for instance, donors who, domestically or international donors, who are becoming more and more inhibited about supporting certain types of groups, certain types of organizing certain countries. And similarly, and having a chilling effect on important infrastructure, like, for example, the banking system, right, which is becoming more and more cautious about operating, for example, bank accounts for civil society, just to give you an example. But then if we turn to the international support ecosystem, so donors, philanthropy, INGOs, et cetera, what we see is that despite the grand statements that Everjoice was mentioning, despite all these grand statements, very, very little has changed, with exceptions of some sort of, with notable exceptions, like I'm sure the feminist funding ecosystem or some thoughtful organizations are still around, but overall, very little has changed. If you think about how much funding goes directly to local groups, there's almost inexistent funding earmarked for grassroots organizing, and I think this connects a little bit with what Everjoice was mentioning. There are persistent disparities in kind of the regions that get more allocations for support, the types of grants in terms of size and quality, who gets to those, which also speak to what Marianne and Everjoice were mentioning. We still see the same access barriers that have been called out for years to access opportunities, and which are fueling the power imbalances that were mentioned already, and I want to repeat. We also see that the quality of resources has not changed, again, despite having asked for years to rethink about the type of resources that are offered, to show the value of flexible multi-year funding, of core funding. We actually don't see much of that. In fact, we see a regression in terms of program funding. It's becoming less and less flexible. We don't understand why, because we thought that during COVID there was a aha moment and people really got it, why flexibility was of the essence. But apparently something is shifting, and for the worse. And we still see that there's a prioritization of very short-term, project-based, depoliticized, single-issue ways of working that are really failing not only to support patient long-term change as it has to be, but also are failing to consider intersectional identities, failing to support critical cross-movement work, all things that I think Everjoice and Marianne also mentioned. Not to mention problematic behaviors that are still there, in terms of donors and intermediaries. So the consequence of all these is that the civil society groups have been and still are working in a context of scarcity and disparities, and had to learn that the hard way to survive is through competition. And this mentality is really breaking the trust and the collaboration, not only within the sector, but also with the support ecosystem, support infrastructure. And definitely having an impact in the fragmentation and the competition of the sector writ large, which hinders its impact overall and its long-term sustainability. So in terms of what kind of support or what kind of approaches would be needed, I am very pleased to hear from Kate about your mindset. I think it's very aligned with what I was going to say, what I would like to say. And for me, it is key that we start building ecosystems of solidarity that are centered on local groups' needs and visions, and that are more intentionally addressing the global imbalances in the resourcing landscape. This, for me, entails investing more in collective spaces where relationships can be built with the various local groups that would like to support, to deepen mutual understanding, build trust, but also unlearn and relearn together. And I'm just echoing what Marianne is trying to do. We really all need to do this effort of unlearning and relearning together and redefining what could be valuable modalities of support, of solidarity, of allyship, etc. We also need to coordinate better across the various actors in the support ecosystem, domestically and international, better strategies centered around these needs and priorities elevated by local groups, by local actors, so that we can leverage on each other's vantage points, but in a more joined up and coordinated way. There are a range of mindset shifts that are needed, and I actually see a role for INTRAC there, from moving us from this scarcity and competition mentality to more like resource sharing and co-creation and collaboration, adopting more intersectional and complex approaches in the way we strategize and organize, moving civil society groups away from this donor dependency, the projectified work, and these more depoliticized agendas. And at the same time, we really need to invest in the local support infrastructure. That means serious investments, long-term investments that can build institutions, that can strengthen the credibility and the networks of these support bodies and networks and organizations at all levels. So I think we need to invest morely to experiment, and experiment means trying, succeeding or not succeeding. That's the guess. No, that's the experimenting with alternative approaches of support. That could include, for example, alternative funding models, alternative payment methods, alternative systems of care and solidarity. We need to try things differently. Maybe they don't work. We have to try with intention. We have to be bold. And lastly, and I won't go into details, really just to repeat myself for the, 10th time this month, more accessible, flexible, nurturing resources, be it financial resources, the core, the multi-year, the flexible, but also non-financial resources. And then I'll stop. We've heard loud and clear that there's a need to hold spaces or to allow groups to have space to come together, to get to know each other, even if it's just to respite, rest, but also to build that trust among them, and then to also strategize together and organize.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, in fact, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. So introducing myself, I'm Isabela. I was born and raised in Brazil and came here to the UK in my late 20s, and I'm British now. So I bring this dual culture of North and South, which are terms I don't particularly like, but everybody has been using it here today, so I'll go with it. And I have a portfolio career. So I started my career as an engineer in the oil sector. So very, very different from what I do now. I'm an independent consultant. Over the last 10 years, I've worked with INTRAC on a number of occasions and evaluations, working in the intersection of development and environment. And I also teach younger university students on climate and the planet and people. So I bring out those, I am saying this because I'm bringing all those aspects of my life with me when I speak about civil society and the challenges that we face. It's quite hard being the last one because I've been nodding here so many things that you have said I agree to and relate to what I had planned to say as well. And for me, one element that is often missed when you talk about challenges is the information overload era that we live now. So there's so much information out there. I was just Googling, and we Americans are exposed to about 34 gigabytes of data every day. And that's equivalent to 186 newspapers a day. And so this data is available for Americans, but everywhere around the world, we have so much information. And what this causes is that our brains just shuts down and we stop thinking. And it's much easier to be radicalized to the extremes, left or right. And that makes it hard for civil society organizations. And part of what you're talking about, the closure of civil society spaces, I think partially is because everyone else is just like don't care mode anymore. There was a research last week of digital media that said 40% of people worldwide actively choose not to read the news because it's too negative. And so if people are not reading the news, where they are getting their information from? Social media. Which type? Short clips, short videos are rising. What does this mean to us that work in this area? People are losing the capacity to appreciate complexity and to appreciate how difficult it is to promote change. And people are taking decisions very quickly based on what the latest video they have seen. So we are here thinking, okay, what we need to change? For me, we need to do something to counter this environment of fake news, of short clips, with people being in the edges, bring people together to the center. And that includes innovation. Clara, we were talking about experimenting, and this is where my engineering side comes from. I always like to innovate, and I think we need to think about how can we innovate on the work we do to use technology, because technology can be used for good as well, and create different stories, create counter narratives, create examples of beautiful things that are happening, because there's so many negative things out there. And I think there's a role for INTRAC, and there's a role for us, independent consultants, part of the INTRAC network, to contribute to this change and innovation. And the other point I wanted to make is that in this information age, with overload of information and people in their mobiles all the time and behind the computer screens, you often forget to focus on the relationships. And for me, this is key. And it links to what Everjoice was saying about who's local. It's like, how can I build a relationship with somebody that's doing work on the ground, be it here in the UK, because in the UK you have local people as well, or in Peru. And how can we use technology to do that? I think there are different ways that we are experimenting, and I wanted to give some examples of that. So during the pandemic, we are all working in international development, like, oh, what are we going to do now? We cannot travel anymore. I used to travel a lot. So I co-produced a project called Learning from Women to Reimagine the Future. And we managed to identify and select women in India, in Kenya, Egypt, in Brazil, and Peru, working really in remote projects. But they had Wi-Fi, and they had mobile phones, smartphones, and that was enough for us to interact with them. We've recorded videos. It took a long time because you have to build a relationship, and building a relationship takes time. But then we created YouTube channel, we created website, we created social media campaign, and all of these with a mindset. I can't remember who mentioned change of mindset of we can learn from them. It's not about us here having all the knowledge. It's like, what can we learn from them? And it's not about giving them a voice, because they already have voice. It's about echoing their voices. And so I think creating these projects are a good way of doing things differently and prototyping ways of connecting virtually. Even though I never met these people, it felt that we were friends. It was quite interesting. And on another example that I give, the same technology, Zoom, Wi-Fi, working with IFAD recently, the role of donors and exploring this technology and being open to budget, even if it's a little bit of the project, put some budget for innovation and creativity and use of technology. And we were able to bring voices of rural farmers in Brazil and Peru to a global corporate knowledge management evaluation. And again, using video, short videos to get people's attentions, and then longer videos and longer reports. So it's mixing the messaging that people give. And the third example that I wanted to give, because we've been talking a lot about the role of international NGOs, local NGOs, and who gets to do what. I think there is a space there for donors to hire people in countries in the global south. So I worked in a project with Argentinian consultancy who subcontracted LSE in London. And I thought that was excellent shift of power in a sense. You have an Argentinian consultancy subcontracting a very well-known UK university. And LSE brought the expertise and the consultancy brought innovation. They were great. They have WhatsApp customized app. They had web developers, video producers, animators. So all these very different methodologies using technology to communicate better the results. Because I think one thing that I always say is nobody learns anything, nobody does anything different by reading 100-page reports.
Yeah.
I think we have to find ways to shape our messaging that are more engaging in this information age, that bring people together rather than isolate.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think that is, everybody's been super disciplined and on time. But more importantly, I think you've been incredibly generous and creative with your contributions to us thinking through this. So I have a few questions. I did promise that I would go back to Everjoice because I don't think she finished her points, because us Africans, we have the gift of the gab. We like to talk, and we like to talk in great detail. But I think perhaps Everjoice, you can also kick us off with some reflection on the question. In your notes, you were talking about, there were 3 points which I don't think you covered. I think you spoke about accompaniment versus training, which I think is a relevant distinction in the context of the strategy. And then perhaps if we can talk about individual and collective care. And that's particularly interesting for me because I've just come out of a 3-day consultation with Ford Foundation here. And they had a theory called what? Trauma-based work, trauma-based processes. And I struggled to get my head around that, but I thought perhaps your input on individual and collective care might help me understand anyway. But if you can just perhaps just kick us off with a brief, in a minute, just tell us a little bit what you were planning to say there. And then I'll ask a quick question and then we'll try and wrap things up. Everjoice?
Thanks, Ashley. I think 2 things. One, I didn't speak about the accompaniment, just to say, I think for me, that's a much more powerful way of supporting civil society and civil society leaders, more than training, right? So capacity, accompaniment, really sitting by the side, being a muse, bouncing ideas, and on an ongoing basis. Collective and individual care. I think this is something that within the feminist movement, which is where I've seen it a lot more, has become something quite central, to recognize, and it's been a long time coming, to say that we can't be doing this work if we are broken. the way we are broken and the way we are traumatized. And so a lot of feminist groups have started putting in place programs, mechanisms in which to take care of individuals' mental health, heart, mind, body, getting counseling for people, supporting people to get out of their local contexts, where those become, for instance, too hot, and just relocating them to some place for a while, even though we know that, kind of sometimes from a gender perspective, you are quite limited, because then, a woman can't move on her own. Very often, she's got the children, she's got the extended family. Not that men don't, but, there's always gender dynamics with these things. And I think one model that I have seen certainly is I think is from Mesoamerica, where they have worked on a model of collective care, right? So rather than looking at this aspect of removing the one human rights defender, the one leader from a context, but rather looking at within the community itself, how can we build, mechanisms of support, so that you don't have to be removing people from there, but the care can be provided within that context. So whether it's, other people stepping in to help someone with something, childcare, or, taking care of the sick in their household, whether it's, providing mental health care support, again, on site within the community, rather than having to relocate people, to other places. And also trying to do this on a more collective basis, because we know that, very often then the trauma that one member of the community might have experienced due to the collective work that we are doing, then tends to impact, all of us. Again, making sure that we're supporting members of communities to be able to, rise again to fight another day. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much. I particularly like the word accompaniment far more than training. So that's why it was a bit of a selfish interest there. But I've got a few questions. What I'm going to do, I think, in the interest of time, and I'm under strict instructions, and as a new board member, I don't want to overstep my boundaries of authority. I'm going to ask a question that I think we'll take it from backwards. We'll start with Clara and work our way towards Kate. And it's a question that I think is of significance. It's one of the questions that Andy had shared with me. How can actors in the civil society support ecosystem respond to the dynamic context that CSOs find themselves in? So I think that already Everjoice, as well as Clara, started mentioning, as Isabela started mentioning quite specific examples about the small, quick wins that we can do. But this is a strategy, after all, about the ecosystem, about what INTRAC is going to be doing to support CSOs. So perhaps a more deliberate focus in your reflections on what the ecosystem can offer, rather than what the CSOs themselves would need to do, right? So, of course, you can respond to the question. And if I'm really generous, and give you 90 seconds each to also add whatever other reflections you might have. Can I just say 2 points that might help you think through things? Marianne had mentioned about the revising INGOs revisiting their space and their role and their existence. So where are these conversations happening? That might be something that an ecosystem provides that space for. And I loved Isabela's point about creating space for beautiful innovation. We very seldom use such poetic language. Beautiful is a lovely word. And we don't see the work we do often as beautiful. We see it as very functional and very political and hard-nosed, but beautiful is just a wonderful thing. So I'm going to start with Isabela and then go to Clara, then to Everjoice, and then to Marianne, and then Kate will wrap us up. How does that sound? Isabela, I'm going to give you the floor, and I'm going to be a little bit strict because we've got to end in a few minutes. So I'm going to give you 90 seconds each, if that's okay. Oh, sorry, one more thing before you start. There's some really interesting comments in the chat section. Do yourself a favor, have a look. There's some really interesting. I'm not going to go through them all because there's a lot. And then it'll start other debates that I don't have authority to go into. So, Isabel, up to you.
Thank you. And I try to keep it short. I think the ecosystem, often I think, what can I get from these people? It's not what only can I give, but what can I get? And inspiration is one of the things that I often get. And so INTRAC's role, I think, is focusing on the relationships between this disparity of individuals, diverse individuals worldwide. Can INTRAC provide a space where these relationships can be built? And I'm very pleased because I have seen INTRAC's network strategy, and I think it's in the right direction. But for me, the best word to create the beautiful, inspirational projects is to work together. Because if you just put people together to talk, and like I'm being Brazilian, we just talk and talk and talk and nothing happens. But if you have a project, if there's a goal, then people will accomplish something together. They will be proud, they will re-energize one another. And part of this care in this world, chaotic world that we are living in, is finding people that think like us, that support similar causes, that face similar challenges, so that we don't feel we are alone. And I think the ecosystem is a place, or many places and spaces where you feel welcomed. You are not alone, and you are with like-minded individuals. Make the world a better place.
Sorry, my icon shifted. Thanks very much, Isabella. I think that was quite succinct. And pause for thought. Collaboration, you had mentioned the point of relationships. It's not just about the money, it's about the personal relationships as well. I think the next person is Clara. Your time starts now.
So yes, so I think for me, what is important is to make sure that the ecosystem is well nurtured, so that there's investments now and time made for that. And so you do need catalysts that enable this to become possible. And the kind of qualities that I think we would have to have in mind for nurturing a well-functioning ecosystem that is also responsive, as you were mentioning, Ashley, have to be intentionally diverse. So there are diverse actors in the ecosystem that plays diverse role. We have to really try and make sure that all of them are connected, are aware of each other, that there's no imbalances in access to knowledge and understanding. The aspect of relationships that Isabel just mentioned is key. So very relational culture that nurtures connections across ecosystem actors. There needs to be an awareness, not this collective intelligence about who are we in the ecosystem, what are we doing, what's missing. And all this can only be done if it's, as I said before, centered around realities, visions, and needs of the groups on the ground that the support ecosystem is meant to support. And that allows then the responsiveness, the adaptiveness, and better coordination at all levels. Gonna stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I think, yeah, not just doing the centering of those we seek to serve as a lip service, but actually doing it with intelligence and with intentionality. I like that. I like that. Everjoice, you get another crack at it.
I think the first thing is to say, do all the parts of the ecosystem actually recognize that there is an ecosystem, right? Because very often we lose sight of that, right? We may intellectually know that there is an ecosystem, but when the rubber hits the road, I think something gets lost there, and then we start wanting to do everything ourselves. And I think that's one of the challenges, recognizing that there is an ecosystem, and actively then, and intentionally, as somebody said, making sure that you are bringing that ecosystem together, you're having the conversations. And I think it goes without saying, though, but it needs to be said. I think we need to have the difficult conversations around power. I am aware that these conversations have started in the sector. We've been having quite a lot of them. in many different places. But I think this is, again, one of those things that makes or breaks, the success of working together, is that very often we are reluctant to surface, to name, and then to squarely tackle power relations amongst ourselves, particularly in this sector. And I think we can only do ourselves a favor by continuously acknowledging our power, acknowledging our privilege, and not shying away from it, and then actively, addressing those unequal relationships wherever they show up, as a matter of course, every single time.
Thanks very much, Everjoice. There's a lot of positive reference to the concept of the ecosystem, and perhaps, and I need to look at the strategy again, but there are also existing ecosystems and systems of support for those who struggle against the oppression. And so perhaps another thing we might think about is how we tap into and use existing indigenous knowledge about these things. I'm going to hand over to, who's next? Marianne.
No, I don't have a lot to add because lots of good things have been said, and I agree in particular with what Everjoice just said. And I just want to add one additional point to it, which is that the language you use is really important. And I've seen a lot of chat about language, and what I notice, and I think it's our experience in a lot of spaces, is that we can also become like, the language can be co-opted, right? So no matter what terms we use, if we're not doing that power analysis that Everjoice talked about, and we're not focusing on relationships as others have talked about, if we're not staying flexible and listening, and if things aren't generatively evolving over time, any language or any concept can become the thing we were trying to get away from in the first place, right? And if we're talking about shifting power, if we don't talk about power and where it sits and the power we each hold and everything that Everjoice just said, then that can happen to any word, ecosystem or, solidarity, right? All these words, and I think they're really helpful for us in stretching our current reality. And like someone's saying, their words make words, and they can become like this, the form trap, where it's like we're saying it's this, but actually it's still that thing we were annoyed with before, or that was unfair and unequitable and unjust before. So let's keep our eyes on the things that matter and where power actually lies in the system. Yeah.
I love it. I'm waging a crusade against jargon. And I find that I end up using more jargon to avoid using the existing jargon. So,
right. So it's
language is...
We need to creatively evolve language. We have to, and we just have to stay
yeah.
aware.
So I think it's appropriate that we ask Kate to perhaps conclude with the reflection on the question, and I think on anything else that might have come up, Kate. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks everyone. I'm feeling like my brain is being a bit hyperactive, and it's not the right moment to say something profound and close because I need to think more. But I just, following on from what Marianne just said, this might sound very contradictory, but I wanted to mention some of the words that really stuck with me from what others have said during the talk, and starting with Marianne sort of talking about the right role and the right relationship, and really sort of thinking what are those right roles and what do they look like, and then EJ talking about unleashing, and I really liked that sort of, we're not capacity building, we're unleashing, and the idea of being a muse, so accompaniment and being the muse and being able to talk things through. I thought Clara talking about moving from scarcity and competition to resource sharing, and throughout everyone's contribution, I think the importance of relationships just kept coming through. And Isabela, as well as the beautiful innovation that Ashley mentioned, the sort of idea of learning together and that sort of reverse subcontracting, and that sort of being full circle, if you like, back to the right role and relationship, bringing together different people with different expertise and different perspectives and different viewpoints and valuing them in a different way. And I think that that's sort of how you start to rebuild or transform the ecosystem, is thinking about all these connecting points and how they work together. And coming back finally to INTRAC and where we are, we're really thinking about the role of those individual consultants and practitioners that support organisations that have such privilege to go into all these different organisations and understand their context and understand the issues they're grappling with and have such access to these different organisations working in different ways. And how can we connect and weave between them so that that learning that could be individual and could stay just within someone's practice can give rise to sort of wider collective knowledge and shifting power. And that's sort of where I'd like to end today. And I hope that you're interested in our strategy. And Andy has put it on our website. I'm sure you'll get a mailing to show you where that is. And I want to thank everyone for coming, but I'll pass back to Ashley to formally close.
Right. So what a fantastic panel of conversants and discussants. It's it seems to be a day of civil society for me, because I was making an input on what Southern African civil society needs to look like, particularly in the context of the elections that are going on in the country at the moment. So thank you very much for adding to that reflective process for me. I'm sure that the beginning of the journey with INTRAC, for me anyway, but for many of you, you've been around for a long time, I'm certainly going to enjoy looking again at the strategic framework. And I hope that this isn't the last time we get to engage. Andy will clearly send all the communications out, and you are all, I'm sure, more than welcome to join the session next week again. Thank you all for your time and for your attention and for your comments and for your creativity and for your generosity.